Hi, my name is Eric Bryant. I'm an 8th grade math teacher at Charleston Middle School, and we're going to be talking about designing formative assessments. If you would like any follow-up information after you work through these things, you're welcome to contact me. My email's right up here, ericbright2002 at yahoo.com, and you can get in touch with me that way. Alright, so how do we design formative assessments that are going to be useful? And then also we'll tag on some summative assessments at the end and how to design those. But starting with the formative, we're actually going to have to know what's the difference between the two. And really that gets to the heart of what's the purpose of assessment in general. So the bottom line for assessment should be, does the student get it? So when we have an assessment sitting in front of us, we want to know, does that student actually understand the mathematics, the mathematical skills that we're trying to get them to master, to understand, or to apply? We want a good measure of that. So if we could maybe put some fancier terms on that, other than just does the student get it, we want to determine to what degree a student has mastered content standards. And we need a high degree of validity and reliability. Now, you may not remember these two words. These two words came up probably in your college assessment course. But validity means we're actually measuring what we say we're measuring. So it is valid. It's actually giving us a good indication of whether or not the student has mastered the mathematics. It's not measuring something else. And the reliability is, can we get consistent results? Not only consistent results across evaluators, so like if I graded an assessment and then another teacher graded an assessment, would we come to basically the same conclusions? But also, can we get consistent results from the same student? So if the student were to take this assessment again or another similar assessment, are we going to get those same results so that we can be sure that really this is kind of the level of mastery that that student has? Okay, now obviously that reliability is going to be more important in summative assessments than in formative assessments. Okay, so what's the difference between the two, between the formative and the summative assessments? A summative assessment is an assessment that summarizes a student's mastery of a standard, of a particular content standard. This is an assessment of learning. So we're trying to see where a student's at. You can think of kind of the dipstick in the oil, where you dip it down and you see at what level the oil's at. Well, that's exactly what we're doing here with the students. We're kind of putting in this dipstick and we're seeing where's that student at what level are they at. These things are usually formal. It's usually a test or a quiz, might be multiple choice, might be short response, might be some word problems, a project, some sort of performance assignment, a portfolio, but there is a formal nature to these things because we want to know, okay, here we are, we're at the end of instruction, we're expecting content mastery now, and now demonstrate mastery of this content in some formal way. This is usually going to be more quantitative than qualitative, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a must. Obviously, we want some qualitative data, but typically speaking, in our current educational environment, we boil it down to some kind of number, okay, or grade A, B, C, D, something like that. Meets, exceeds if you're on a standards based. So this is the summative. We're trying to get a picture of how well a student has mastered a standard at a specific time. Now there is a time component to this which is critical in that we can reasonably expect content mastery at this time, and so we give them the summative assessment to see where are you at. This is summarizing what you have learned. Okay. Now when we make summatives, we want to make sure that these assessments tie directly to the standards, so tie directly into our Common Core standards, and we probably want to make sure that they include multiple levels of learning. So, we've got Bloom's taxonomy, you've got Webb's depth of knowledge, got a couple of things to bounce through there, and then also we're going to keep in mind the conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and application that's demanded in Common Core. So different levels of learning, what is it that we're actually expecting? Now, the tying to standards kind of gets us to the validity. Are we actually grading what we're supposed to be grading? The including multiple levels of learning, that gets us to what degree has a student mastered this. So that's going to differentiate between those students who really, really are excellent and really know this versus the students who, they got the basics of the standard down, and students who are still kind of struggling. So that multiple levels is going to differentiate there. And we want to make sure that any summative assessment is really going to summarize their overall learning progress, where they're at this time, and it also needs to be some sort of result that all stakeholders can understand. So can the kid understand what the assessment tells us? Can the parents understand? Because generally speaking, summative assessments, these are the ones that are going to be wrapped up into a student's grade. This is going to be, on the report card. It's going to be part of their grade. And so everybody needs to understand where these things come from and how they work. So that's a summative assessment. And just one caveat, make sure that you've offered students several examples prior to giving them the summative assessment as to what meeting the standard would look like. Okay, so that they've kind of got to know that. What's this going to look like? And we don't want it to just kind of come out of left field. And this is partially to establish that reliability, so that the students have seen it, they know what meeting looks like, and then they can reproduce, or not reproduce, but demonstrate mastery of their own content understanding because they know what that process should look like ahead of time. So that's getting at the reliability. All right, contrast this with formative assessments, which is where we're headed. A formative assessment is assessment for learning. So we're still forming mastery. We're still forming our understanding. Okay, so this is a formative assessment for learning, and it's going to inform us in our teaching, and it's going to inform us as to what learning strategies are best, but it could also inform parents, it could also inform students. It's basically a heads up before we get to the summative assessments. It's a, hey, here's an area that you really need to work on. This is an area that you need to target specifically to get better at before we hit those quizzes, tests, or other big parts of your grade that are really going to summarize your learning. So we want to use these formative assessments in a way that are going to benefit students in monitoring their own learning, but also we want to be able to use the information ourselves as teachers to be able to make changes in our instruction based on what we see. Okay, so because of this, the nature of how we're using these things, these formative assessments, then they might be formal or they might just be informal. In fact, we take informal formative assessments all the time. You're always glancing around your classroom and saying, I don't think they get it. I need to go through another example, or those kids over there, I kind of need to go talk to them as a group, but it looks like everybody else has got it. That's formative assessment. We really kind of do this naturally as teachers. So a lot of the informal stuff is already there. So we may be taking a look through this through these set of videos. The set of videos here will look at some formal ways to make formative assessments. Okay, you might be looking for things like even effort and participation and exit slips that are a variety of things where they don't necessarily tie directly to the standard, but they can inform us as to how you're going to do with the standard. So if you're not putting forth your best effort, if you're not participating, it is likely that will have some effect on your learning. And so that, even though it's not tied directly to the standards, can be useful. And we're gonna see in a little bit that we want to tie most of our things to the standards, but since these things may be more qualitative, we're going to have more of that information about, hey, you know what, there's some frustration going on here. How can we work past that frustration and get some more participation and engagement with the mathematics? And to do that, we're going to need more meaningful feedback to students. So we can't just slap a grade on top and hand it back to the students and expect that to be worthwhile, because as soon as students see a grade, the first thing they do is they look at their grade and then they throw it away. That's the end. Once they see a grade, it's over. So, for example, in my class, when I grade homework, I never put any score on top of it. If they got everything right, I just put good job or something like that. But if anything's wrong, I'll mark where something's wrong, and then I'll also write a little note. Hey, be careful of be careful of your positive and negative signs if it's integers, or be careful. It seems like you're mixing up your exponent rules. So something like that, so that students know how they can improve. Okay, because if we look at the bottom here, the purpose is to improve student learning. We're trying to improve how they learn, And so that's why this assessment is for learning, because we want them to improve based on what we get. All right, so here's what the formative process looks like. We start off with, where is the student at in their content mastery? So that almost feels like a summative, it's put at the dipstick in, where are they at? But the difference here is that the next place is, where does the student need to be to show content mastery? So we have an expectation already in place in a formative that they are not at content mastery. We know they're not at content mastery. We want to know where they're at in their journey, and then where do they need to be in this journey? And then the next piece is, how do we get there? How do we get to that end point? So this is why it's so important that formative assessments don't get mixed up with summative assessments. In other words, we're not reporting a formative assessment as part of a student's grade because we know that they don't have content mastery yet. Okay, so even if a student does really well, say on a homework assignment, why did they do really well? Well, maybe they did really well because they were just copying off their neighbor. Maybe they did really well because they were just regurgitating the information they just got in class, but they actually don't have an understanding of what they're doing. They just memorized that process really quickly and kept it in mind, and by the next day it's already gone. Well, that doesn't demonstrate content mastery. It tells us where students are at in their learning level, and where they need to, how we need to go from here to get to the end point of mastery, but it doesn't actually tell us that the student has it mastered. And so it's critical that these things don't go into a student's grade, a final grade, because otherwise, in my opinion, that's just mean, because we know that they don't have it mastered, and knowing that they don't, we're putting that towards the grade. So the students who are being honest and saying, hey, I don't get it yet, we're penalizing them for that. Instead of saying, that's awesome, I'm glad you know that you don't get it, because that's the first step in the process to getting better. And instead, we should be encouraging that. So this is some of the value of formative assessment, is to have those discussions with students. And then finally, once we get kind of that picture of where students are at, where they need to be, and we've kind of decided how they need to get there, then we got to act. If we don't act on formative assessment information, then there's no reason to gather it. Okay, so if we're gathering information just for the sake of it, we had some data experts come into our district at one time and say how awesome they were because they were getting teachers to take 3 formative assessments, formal formative assessments, a day per class period, 3. And they were writing a grade down in the grade book 3 times per day, per class period. And I said, well, what are the teachers doing with that data? And the guy said, well, we're gathering 3 pieces of formative assessment. I said, yes, but what are you doing with that formative assessment data? Well, we don't know, hems and haws, and nothing. They weren't doing anything with it. Well, then why are we wasting the teacher's time? Because that's what that boils down to. And wasting time for the students. So please, if you're not going to act on it, don't do it. Don't feel like you have to implement formative assessment data, gathering into every single moment in your classroom. Do it when it's useful and when it's going to help the students. If it's going to help you help the students, or help the students to help themselves, that's when to use formative assessment. Okay. All right. When we come back, we'll look at some examples of formative assessments and what this could look like. So we'll be back in a moment.